Well, welcome to our Postgrad Podcast for the fourth instalment for this year. It's our pleasure to welcome to the podcast Professor Oliver Crisp, who will be teaching a unit at the Brisbane School of Theology a little later in this year. While we were very sad to lose one Oliver, we are delighted to welcome another. So welcome, Oliver.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here.
Now, your works will be familiar to many of our listeners and watchers. Many books by Oliver Crisp sitting on our library shelves and in our personal libraries. But tell us a little bit about yourself. At present, you occupy a chair in St Andrews, but as I understand it, you were not born in Scotland.
No, you may be able to tell from my accent that I wasn't born in Scotland. I originated down south of the border in Englandshire, as they call it up here. And I was born in London, and born and raised in London, and came up to Scotland for my university education. Studied up in Aberdeen, did my first 2 degrees there, and then ended up going back to London, to King's College London, to do my PhD. When during the time of Colin Gunton, so when Trinitarian theology was at its height in London, and all that was going on with that, so those were exciting times. And then, of course, I was seeking employment, and I ended up coming here to St Andrews to teach for a couple of years on a teaching fellowship, and then went and did a postdoc in the United States at the University of Notre Dame, and then taught for about 5 or 6 years at the University of Bristol down on the west coast of England, just under Wales, with some terrific colleagues there, and did another stint in the US during that time at Princeton at the Center of Theological Inquiry. And then we ended up going to California, where I taught at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena in Los Angeles for about 8 years before coming here back to St Andrews, where I started. This time, as you say, to the chair of analytic theology here in St Mary's College. So a lot of traveling, but it's been fun. It's not been boring anyway.
And it was the Scottish beaches that brought you back from California.
That's right. It was the Scottish beaches and the Scottish temperature, which I just couldn't stay away from. That was definitely it. Yeah. It's certainly a change coming from sunny Los Angeles to St Andrews, but each has its charms.
So you mentioned you have a chair in analytic theology. Just for the benefit of our listeners, what is analytic theology?
It's a good question. When I was, let me back up a bit and say, when I was at Fuller, I was a professor of systematic theology. So, talking about Christian doctrine, those sorts of things. Analytic theology is a kind of recent development on the scene, as it were, in the last 10, 15 years. And it's really blossomed in that period. And now there's people doing analytic theology in various different places in the world. And there are different answers to the question, what is analytic theology? But I think my way of thinking about it is that analytic theology is a way of pursuing theology using or being informed by a particular philosophical literature, that is the philosophical literature of the analytic tradition, which is the Anglo-American tradition of the 20th century. Most modern theology, when it's looked for philosophical resources, has tended to look to the so-called continental tradition, of people like Heidegger and Derrida and Foucault and people like that. Much less so until recently the analytic tradition. And so in many ways, analytic theology is a sort of method for doing systematic theology, you might say, that appeals to the kind of sensibilities, thought forms, literature, ideas of analytic philosophy to fund its theological arguments. That's certainly how I understand it, and that's how I tend to pursue it. So it's you might think of it as a method for doing theology, something like that.
Yes, and you will be no doubt inducting students into that method as you come to teach on Zoom. It's such a shame that we wouldn't be able to host you in person, but that small thing called COVID-19 has gotten in the way of that. But you will be undoubtedly inducting our students into the marvels of analytic theology as you teach. We have the pleasure of hosting you to teach a unit on the theology of Jonathan Edwards. I'd be interested to hear you say a little about what piqued your interest in Jonathan Edwards.
Edwards is a remarkable theologian, I think, by any estimation. You might think of him in some ways as a kind of a precursor to analytic theology. I mean, in as much as he's the sort of thinker who's very analytical and careful and deeply engaged in theological questions. So I did my doctoral work on Edwards with Paul Helm at London, and have remained interested in Edwards subsequently, although I've gone on to do other things. The thing that piqued my interest in Edwards went way back to when I was an undergraduate, and I did a dissertation as an undergraduate on his freedom of the will. And I think what attracted me to Edwards was the fact that he was a thinker who was really a kind of original in a serious and substantive sense. He's someone who thought for himself and thought through the implications of the positions that he held very deeply and carefully. So he had this extremely impressive intellect, but he was also someone who was deeply engaged with the life of the church. And that's not always the case. I mean, of course, he's an intellectual leader in terms of his standing in theology, and that's increasingly recognized now, I think. But he was also a leader of the emergent evangelicalism of the 18th century in the United States. And so he has this unusual place of being someone whose thought is engaged with in the ivory towers of places like Harvard and Yale, as well as being read by Pentecostal pastors in Brazil, as some of the recent Edwards scholars who've written on this, people like Michael McClymond and Jerry McDermott, have made the case that Edwards is a theologian for the 21st century precisely because he spans such a broad range of interests, and he engages people from developing countries where pastors are working at the coalface right the way through to people who are sitting in Ivy League colleges. So, I mean, that's very unusual. You don't tend to find someone who has that range of interest, and it's really that attracted me to, and remains an attraction for me with respect to Edwards, that he's someone who has this wide range of interests, and he has this holistic vision of what theology is about, how it should affect not just the life of the mind, but the life that we live.
I guess one of the remarkable things as well is a missionary to the Indians. That's
right, yes. And one of the things about Edwards is he had lots of different careers, which few people know about. I mean, he was a pastor for most of his life. He was a college tutor at the early Yale. He ended up being a missionary to the Native Americans. And then he was one of the first presidents of what is now Princeton University. So he had a range of different roles throughout his life. And yet he spent the latter part of his career out on what was then the frontier in Stockbridge as a minister to the Native Americans, the Mohawks in particular. The Mohicans rather in particular. And that was a really remarkable period of his life. In fact, funnily enough, his son, Jonathan Edwards Jr., who also became a theologian and a college president, had a life that mirrored his father's in some respects, wrote one of the first grammars in one of the Native American languages. He spoke fluent Mohican, and so he ended up writing a grammar of a Native American language, which is really interesting.
Remarkable. Well, for our listeners who might be interested in Jonathan Edwards, for perhaps not his investigations into smallpox vaccines, but perhaps in mission work, theology, preaching, philosophy, jump onto the BST website for more details about how you can either audit or take this unit for credit. You've been listening to Postgrad Podcast, Professor Oliver Christie.
Thanks for having me.